Okay, the first part of this afternoon, I think the agricultural and climate scientists have really set it up nicely here to begin to think about what is some of this science mean. We in agriculture are living through an extremely difficult period. Market turmoil, sustained low commodity market prices, and then flooding, this unpredictable weather, shifting climatic conditions. And it's our hope today that as we think about the science of what we know and we begin to have our farmers talk to us a little bit about how they're putting some of these things in practice, and then we hope to have them talk a little bit about what they're doing, and we will end the program this afternoon with an opportunity for each of you to begin to think about, well, what is the future of agriculture in Iowa? What is it that we need to do? How do what kind of a vision do we have, and then how do we actually make that happen? In spring of 2012, we did a Midwest corn soybean farmers random sample survey and found that more than 50% were concerned or very, very concerned about frequent extreme rains. Dennis Toddy showed us that picture. Thank you, Dennis. A similar percent were concerned about weed and insect pressure. But most noteworthy, and I'm thinking about spring of 2012, so if you can think back to spring of 2012, we had a very, very wet year, and then we moved into a drought. The Mississippi River, they had some of the driest flow that they've ever had. So we actually had a little bit of both. But the spring of 2012, when farmers were actually beginning to think about planting, 90% of all those farmers thought that there was too much uncertainty about the impacts of climate change to justify changing any of their current agricultural practices or strategies. Fast forward to 2017, a random sample survey of specialty crop growers in Michigan and Ohio found that 60% were concerned or very, very concerned about increased weed pressure, insect pressure, changes in health and timing of their pollination, and a higher incidence of crop disease. And tellingly, many of them have perennial crops. They were very concerned about the fluctuations in spring temperature. So way more than half were finding that that was a problem. And 45% of them reported that there was too much uncertainty about the impact of climate to justify changing agricultural practices and strategies. Last year, the grain farmers of Ontario, Canada, reported one of the worst years of an outbreak of mycotoxin caused by the fungus Gibberella, a fusarium pathogen that's the source of ear rot in corn and head scab in wheat. Cool, wet weather during and after silking provides the optimum conditions for ear rot development. This past spring, here in Iowa, wet weather and flooding. We've already had that conversation, but that wasn't just in the upper Midwest. Canada experienced that also. The harvest has been delayed due to both too short of a growing season and not being able to, perhaps not planting seed. That was a short season, and then our weather that we have in terms of rain and snow in the last couple of months. Uncertainty and risk continue to stalk agriculture. However, we can no longer afford to wait and see how the uncertainty in weather and climate sorts itself out. We must find new ways to adjust and change many of the practices that worked in the past, but no longer seem to ensure either our productivity or the integrity of our water and soil resources. We've invited 4 farmers from Iowa this afternoon to talk about their farming systems, how weather and climate challenges have affected their production, some of the adaptations that have worked, and maybe they'll even share some of the things that aren't working so that we can learn from the things that they've actually tried. After they've shared their experiences and thinking, we're then going to move to a conversation amongst all of us, concerning the future of agriculture in Iowa, and more importantly, what are the actions that we need to take that would help us face the uncertainty that's happening. I want you to join me in welcoming our Iowa panel, and if Brian Sievers from Stockton could come up, Brian Kuzer from Nevada, and Dave Walton from Wilton, if I could ask you to come and take a seat. We had a fourth farmer, Crystal Doolittle from Williams, and she had planned to come this morning. She sent me an email at sunrise, actually, as she looked out and believed what the weather was actually saying. Today's a beautiful day to be in the field. They're a month behind in their harvest. Tomorrow doesn't look very good to be out in the field. And I said to her, she's exactly where she needs to be. She needs to be out in the field, taking advantage of what few good days that we have. So what I want to do is begin this conversation by asking each one of our farmers to begin talking a little bit about their farming system and why they think it's a successful operation. And then we'll begin to move into some other conversations. And so, Bill, if we could start.
Ray, you promised I wouldn't go first, remember?
Oh.
Again, thank you, Ray, for putting this together. And I'm probably one of the luckiest ones here because I live just east of Ames. And as Dr. Dan's still in here, I'm probably the most blessed farmer around because between the two new Dr. Dans at Iowa State University, the one at the vet college and Dan at the ag side, they spend a lot of time out at our farm. And to have that learning center that close, it's really helped us to be able to go forward and learn a little bit about our operation. It was started by my great-grandfather back at the turn of the century, and then they lost the farm during the Depression. And my dad was fortunate enough to get started farming again and came along, and I'm actually the I'm the fourth generation, and my son is the fifth. He's a graduate of Iowa State University, and I know when I started farming in 1977, I knew it all. And when I had a 27-year-old son come back home from college, he knows it all. Just ask him. So our farming practices have really changed the last 5 or 6 years because of the technology change, because when I look at when I started farming in 1977, my first year was a drought. We lost everything. Thank goodness we had hogs. My next year we were wiped out with insects, and the third year was hail. And so for the first 3 years of my career, I had no crop. And you have to figure out as a farmer, how are you going to make those payments? And thank goodness for FMHA. But anyway, a little bit about our operation. It's a cattle farming operation. We're permitted for 5,200 head, and we've basically gone under roof with about 60% of the animals. We have a farming operation where we basically concentrate on growing seed from Monsanto and other companies. Through the years, then we've worked with Deere & Company and Monsanto, Bayer, DuPont, many of the large companies as far as designing machinery. A few years ago, we worked with Deere to design a baler to pull behind the combine so we didn't take the stalk off. We just took what comes through the combine and left the stalk in the field, which we left the ash in the field in that case. We've done many, many years of bale studies because of the DuPont cellulosic ethanol plant that started in Nevada. I was one of the founders of Lincoln Way Energy, so been in the ethanol thing, I think, probably since the start in Iowa, and then helped found the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, where Monty Shaw is our director there. So we feel very blessed what's happened in this state. And so our farming operation has basically gone back to how can we make each acre more profitable or more dollars with making sure we're conserving or taking care of soil health and water quality. So 3 years ago, Monsanto Bayer has been very good about helping me with projects because as farmers, we don't have the capital, and living next to Iowa State University to be able to have their expertise there. In 2004, we designed a feedlot operation called Alternative Technology, where we actually use settling basins and VIBs and vegetative treatment areas to if there was any runoff, it was cleansed naturally, and then the grasses were fed back to the livestock. Now, through climate change, we built this for the 24-25, which was the largest rainfall in a 24-hour period the last 25 years. Well, guess what? That's doubled. And just in the past 4 or 5 years. So it's been a real challenge as far as the feedlot industry, and that's one reason we went under roof, because of the challenges coming with all the water that's coming along. So then about 3 years ago, I have the original farm back that my great-grandfather settled, and it happens to have the soil types of about every soil in Iowa. We go from 92 CSR clear down to land that has never been tilled. So I went to them and I said, and the reason this started was my wife sat on the EPC commission for 8 years. There should be a award for people that sit on the EPC commission because of the challenges and the rules and regulations that they help and maintain. So from there, then we've given 240 acres, or actually, Monsanto's helping us to understand soil quality and water health, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But thank you again, Ray, for putting this on.
Thank you, Bill. Bryan?
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Bryan Sievers. I'm a farmer from eastern Iowa, Scott County. I also want to thank Ernie Shea and Ray for putting this on, as well as Iowa State University, Dean Robeson, and thank you, Dr. Morton, for leading our panel discussion. We, as a family, our roots run deep here in Iowa. My wife is from central Iowa, and her family goes back to the mid 1800s in the Marshall County area. We met at Iowa State, and we've had 2 children, as well as a daughter-in-law graduate from Iowa State. So we're really an Iowa State family. We focus in our family farming operation on stewardship and conservation. We believe the natural resources we're blessed with, our air, land, water, sun, and people, are those that are gifts from God that we need to value and enhance. And to hear Dean Robeson talk earlier about we may be the first generation to actually pass our farms on to the next generation or generations in better condition, makes it all worth it. Makes it all worthwhile in the efforts that we focused on over the years. And those are things like, obviously, grassed waterways, terraces, buffer strips, field borders, contour farming, no-till farming, strip farming. The only thing I don't think that we've implemented thus far are prairie strips. And Dr. Heaton, I think we're going to have to take a look at those seriously moving forward. The unique thing about our farming operation, and both my wife and I are 1982 graduates. I worked for 5.5 years with Farm Credit Services, and then in 1989 left that after also spending 2 years in Minnesota working for Elanco Products Company. We started farming full-time in mid-1989. And then have focused really on, as I talked about, our natural resources, our conservation efforts, and stewardship of our land. But in fast forward to 2000, I was elected to the Iowa House of Representatives, and then in 2002 was elected to the Iowa Senate. In 2004, the voters of my district decided I would be better off going back to farm, and so we decided to do that. Focused on how could we grow our farming operation. We have a beef cattle background. My parents, grandparents, great-grandparents have all fed cattle over the years, and we wanted to expand our beef cattle feedlots. So we embarked on a journey that has led us to a point where we constructed 2 1,200-head beef cattle confinement buildings, and it also includes 2 anaerobic digesters. We constructed, finished those, and have commissioned those in 2013. And so for the last 6+ years, we've operated our commercial feedlot along with our anaerobic digesters as we focused on trying to kind of close the loop, if you will, on the resources that we produce and that we're blessed with. So when we commissioned our anaerobic digesters in 2013, we've commissioned it solely on cattle manure. The anaerobic digester industry is a pay-it-forward industry. In order to seed your digesters, it's like a friendship loaf. You have to bring in live bacteria from other facilities, and so we hold 400,000 gallons of digestate from the Amana Farms digester. So that essentially was the seed that we needed for our digesters, and so hopefully someday I'll be able to provide that to another new digester owner-operator in eastern Iowa. and provide them the seeds that they need for their anaerobic digesters. So it was only beef cattle manure that we started on. After about 2 years, we realized and decided we need to focus on bringing in other organic waste streams, and we have now include about half of our waste streams, about half of the 55,000 gallons that we process in our anaerobic digesters on a daily basis, comes from industrial agricultural processing facilities. So we pretty much cover the gamut when it comes to the species. We get chick hatch waste from a local chick hatchery. We get turkey processing waste from West Liberty Foods. We get wastewater from PB Liner in North Davenport, which is a advanced pork processing plant. We also get waste streams from ADM in Clinton, ADM out of Decatur, Illinois, a potato processor in north central Illinois, along with the beef cattle manure that we're producing and comes out of our feedlot. So our digesters run 24/7. I'm the night shift guy, so when there's a generator that goes down or an agitator that acts up, well, I'm the guy that gets up and takes care of it. But essentially, in order to make facilities like this successful on your farming operation, that's what it takes. It takes someone who's heavily invested in that operation and the success of that operation and has real ownership and value and places a high value on the success of that to make sure you respond when needed. It's no different than pulling a calf at 2 in the morning. So the bottom line is those are all living creatures in those digester tanks that help us not only generate some revenue to pay for it, but also to then pull that material back out of those tanks on a daily basis. As I said, we process about 55,000 gallons a day in. That means that much has to come back out, and we process that by separating the liquid and solid fractions. The liquid we store in a lagoon until we use it as our fertilizer source on our 2,200 acres of corn and soybeans. The solids we stockpile and use those on our land where we take our corn stover bales off. We'll take about 3,500 corn stalk bales off every year that we use as bedding in our cattle barns, and the biofibers that we produce from our digesters will go back on that land. I'll just conclude with this. I guess, take-home message is the anaerobic digestion of organic waste streams will provide tremendous soil health benefits. So we're seeing that firsthand. Our soil tests are showing tremendous increases in organic matter content in as little as 4 to 5 years. We're seeing a 50% increase in organic matter content in our soils through the grid sampling that we do in our soils. So when you can see those kind of results that quickly, that to me is the real benefit we're deriving from an anaerobic digester facility. It isn't necessarily the electricity we sell to Alliant Energy, although that does pay the bills, but it's that soil health we can bring home and show how it matches our overall philosophy of enhancing our natural resources and implementing conservation practices that will be sustainable for future generations.
Thank you, Bryan. Yes. Dave, would you introduce us to your operation, please?
Sure. I have a lot of voice. My story is unlike the other two gentlemen up here. I'm a 7th generation Iowa farmer, 6th born here in the state. We have the distinction of being one of the first settlers in the area that we call, or Cedar County, which is not far from Bryan's home. So we have a long history of agriculture here in the state, and one of the things that is always forefront in our mind is that our forefathers did the best they can with what they knew, and we learned from not only their successes but their failures and moved on. So that's kind of where the history of our family comes from. We are a soybean, corn, hay, pasture, beef, cattle, and sheep operation, so we're fairly diversified. Cow-calf, we're not a feedlot, although we do feed a few out for locker beef. We started no-till in about 2008 or 9. I'm not exactly sure of the year. We just kind of did it. We took on some new land, and we knew the benefits of no-till, but we did it more for a cost savings and a labor savings. The land that we picked up was about 15 miles away, and the prospect of hauling tillage equipment 15 miles over and 15 miles back 3 or 4 times a year did not appeal to me. So I made the executive decision that by God, we're going to no-till this and we're going to make it work. So we did and haven't looked back. About 90% of our operation is no-till. The only tillage we do is on a small tract of land that is leased to a seed company to do research plots on. And we even kind of sneak as little tillage on that as we can and still keep them happy. We've used precision technology to do variable rate. We started out with variable rate phosphorus and potassium based on grid sample mapping. In the early days, we did grid samples based on about a 5-acre grid. And then we went to zone sampling based on soil type. That still didn't quite fit what we were trying to do, so we went to zone sampling by yield level, and that has started to work a little better. There's a little conflict with myself and the retailer that we work with on how to best do that. We argue about it every year. I say, I'm paying the bill, this is the way we're going to do it. So until we find a better system, that's the way we've moved forward on that. More recently, we've started variable rate nitrogen. We put a base rate up front, and then we variable rate based on yield goal, soil type, weather factors on that. So we are a family farm, kind of a one-man show most of the time. I have an older son that's graduated community college and has been working into the operation. I think this is his 4th season with us. My younger son is finishing up at the University of Missouri. Apologies to the Iowa State folks in the room. That's where I went to school, but y'all don't have a swim program there. He swam for the University of Missouri for 4 years, and that's what took him there. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have been a Cyclone. I think in a nutshell, that's it. Let's get forward with the discussion.
I think that gets us started. Our climate scientists earlier this afternoon spoke about global change in both weather and climate, as well as in Iowa. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the last 4 or 5 years, what kinds of weather and climate changes you've seen, and what are those challenges, how they've affected your production, how they've affected your soil and water. We heard Mike Castellano say that you can do all the right things and maybe things still don't quite turn out the way that you'd hoped. So we're interested in how weather and climate has affected what you've done. And then were there some unexpected opportunities that occurred when you tried to adapt, and when rather than just thinking, oh, the weather, I have to do something, did you discover that perhaps maybe you innovated or you did something that you might not have done otherwise because of that particular situation? So, Bill, would you like to?
I'll let him go first this time.
Okay, I'm great.
Bill, you
Brian?
did wonderful leading off. I don't know why you didn't.
Brian, you want to lead us off?
Sure, I'll give it a
Did I do that right?
shot.
Yeah.
Well, certainly the weather and the climate challenges we faced over the last 2 years in particular have been very, very significant. I've heard it said here a number of times, when you used to have, I think it was Mr. Frederickson and Beck who said, when it seemed like you had all spring to plant and all summer to cultivate and all fall to harvest, and now it's about 20 days total. And that has made it incredibly challenging. And even for us, as we become more intense with livestock production, we wrap up 3,500 round bales. They have to be moved off the field. Then we need to apply our liquid effluent. That all has to be done. So harvest is really only about, when we finish with harvest, we're only about half done with our fall. And so that has made it tremendously challenging. And we've done all that we can in terms of investing in equipment and technology, but trying to deal with the vagaries of Mother Nature has made it extremely challenging. Unexpected opportunities, I'm just trying to think about some of those. Certainly, the opportunity to realize and really maybe stumble into it, the benefits that we are seeing from being able to do in our anaerobic digester tanks in a period of 28 to 40 days what takes Mother Nature 3 to 5 years, and that's decompose residue in the field. We can do that in our tanks in a very, very short period of time, is one of those unexpected opportunities because that allows us to recycle those nutrients, and the organic matter that we're essentially processing in those digester tanks is really the great opportunity, and has allowed to see us those improvements in our organic matter content, our nutrient levels, and hopefully our soil health. Once again, despite all of the challenges we had tremendous yields this fall. We had 70-plus bushel beans, 230 bushel corn, and I would never, ever have bet on those kind of results with the challenging spring, because we had late planting. We planted a lot of corn in early June, planted a lot of soybeans in June as well. But nevertheless, it might just be that some of those things that we've stumbled upon with regard to our soils and what we're seeing from the practices we've implemented may be providing us an opportunity to help weatherproof those soils. And I think that that's where climate change solutions start, is in those soils.
Yeah, I guess just one of the things I was thinking of when you posed that question was that we started no-till in, I guess, about 2008, 2009. The drought of 2012 kind of sealed it for me. We saw resiliency in the yields on the farms that we had no-tilled versus the tilled farms. We didn't see the loss in yield on those no-till farms. And even in the middle of that drought, you could still go through those farms and push back the residue and find soil moisture. On the tilled ground, we couldn't find soil moisture. We had cracks you could stick your hand into past your wrist, and I don't have little hands. But on those no-tilled farms, we still had moisture there. On the wet years, it hasn't hurt us as much either, because I think we have a greater infiltration rate. We farm mostly ground that's been pretty well drained through a tile drainage system. So, we're seeing that there's a resiliency in that system that I didn't maybe expect when I started into it. Another thing that we do, we're trying to find a fit for cover crops. It's worked in some farms. It's not worked as well as I'd like it to in other farms. But where it's a real key for me, since we're a cow, calf, and sheep operation, we're starting to graze those cover crops. We'll try to get them in early enough in the spring, put a mix in that has some grazing benefits, and so we'll get anywhere from 2 weeks to a month of grazing in the fall, and then we'll graze those off again in the spring prior to burn down and planting. So we're kind of getting a double benefit there. It cuts down on my need for hay, harvested hay, and it gives the livestock a place to go. We don't have to bed them, we don't have to feed them, it just makes their care a little bit easier for us. So that's something that we're gonna try to expand. Unfortunately, in our area, most of that type of livestock operation is gone. So if we want to expand it to other farms, we have to build fences, and fences are expensive. So we're kind of picking and choose where we do it right now. But those are a couple of things. We have seen more extreme in the weather. Like others have said, you get a shower, an inch of rain a week, it'd soak in, you get back to work in a day or two. Now we're seeing those 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 inch rains that are really hammering us, and it's coming more often. And then this year was sort of the hallmark. We started out wet last fall. It carried all the way through winter and spring. And then when it stopped, it stopped. We finished planting about June 10th, and I don't think we had a significant rain until sometime in late August. So we went 60 days with probably 1.5 inches or 2 inches of rainfall. If we hadn't had a full subsoil moisture system coming in, we'd have really saw more drop off in yield than we did. But then when it started raining, it didn't stop. So we're in a really wet fall, and it's slowed harvest down. It's slowed everything down. We have manure to haul yet. We got our corn stalk bales up. We got them off, but we wrapped them because we put them in an inline wrapping system, so it protects them from the weather. We don't normally have to do that, but I'm looking at the weather forecast and go, it's going to keep raining. These bales aren't going to keep the way I'd like them to, so we're going to protect them somehow. So those are a couple of the adaptations we've had to do because of it.
I thought one of the greatest things I did in my farming career was not let my son come back right away after college. And I made him go work for someone else for a few years. He worked for Deere & Company. And I said, you have to be gone at least 3 years. 3 years to the day he came home, and he said, I hope you're ready. Well, I grew up in the 70s, and I'm a tillaholic. I mean, that was my world. You cultivated 3 or 4 times in the summer, as that one gentleman said, that's all you did, and baled hay. And since Tim's come back, our operation has a total flip. He said he wanted to start using cover crops 5 or 6 years ago, and I said, Tim, in Story County, this black dirt, you can't no-till and you can't do those things. And that was absolutely the wrong thing for a dad to tell a 25-year-old kid. Because guess what? Today we're doing it. And someone made the comment about infiltration of water with cover crops. We've got a couple farms that right off the bat we did that. And he called me up one Sunday morning. He says, Dad, come to the cornfield. He says, I got to talk to you. Well, I was up choring, and I thought, if I was 25 years old, that's the last place I'd be is in the middle of a cornfield looking at something. So I go out there, and he goes, look at that field over there. And we just had a 3-inch rain. He goes, look at the ponds over there. He goes, look, we don't have any ponds here because of this cover crop. There was enough root and whatever happens with cover crops, we got rid of that water right away, or it went away. So then all of a sudden he takes a shovel out and he puts it in the ground and he says, look at this. And it was clear full of worms. He said, we haven't had worms like this for many, many years. So it's something that's really helped us change with cover crops, and it's a challenge in Story County because of the what we call black gumbo. But I think the other thing that really helped us is, as the other panelists said here, we need 10,000 round bales a year for feed and for the bedding operation of the cattle. And with working with John Deere and coming up with what we call the single pass baler now that's for sale, that you can purchase today, is that when you go out there, we're pulling that baler and we're making bales while we're combining. So we can get about half of our bales made while we're doing the combining, and if we need to go out and get more later on, we can. And if we do go take the stalks off, we'll actually go back with a manure program right away. But what we're doing is we're taking what comes through the combine and putting it in a bale. So we're leaving the stalk in the field that has the nutrients that need to go back down in the soils. Well, how many of you have walked out into a cornfield and seen a corn cob that could be 3 or it could be 5 years old? All of a sudden, we're finding out that we're taking probably the worst villain off of the field because it takes nutrients to break that cob down. And now we're taking that off the field and we're making it for cattle feed because we'll actually grind those bales. And there's no ash in it because before we were picking that up off the ground, and so you're going to get a natural ash through that bale. But the unintended consequences, I think, go back to the question was, all of a sudden we found out that every one of those bales had from 4 to 7% starch in them because of the phantom loss through combines. And so now all of a sudden we've got a product that becomes a tremendous, how many of your parents and grandparents ground ear corn when they were feeding the cattle hundreds of years ago, many years ago? Well, all of a sudden now we can recompose that in a different way, but yet we're leaving the stalks in the field to help protect the soils and to, if we need them, we'll go back, but we're leaving what we need to leave there, and we're taking that villain cob off that's going to take more nutrients to break it down over many years. So in a sense, we're using less fertilizer, and we're actually variable rating all of our, as I'm sure Bryan is, we variable rate all of our manure today. So we don't go out and just blanket a field with 10 ton. We'll go through and put on what needs to be put on there. So through the unintended consequences, we found out that we've come up with a product and in a sense added more value to that acre because we can utilize a product off of it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question I didn't warn you that I was going to ask you, okay?
Oh, that's fine.
And it's primarily because of the conversation that you've already begun. Because we were sort of focused on profitability and what are the things they're doing in terms of keeping your production up, but all of you have talked a little bit about soil and water, and I want to know how you're monitoring what metrics or what strategies are you using to actually monitor what happens to both your soil and your water. Rick Cruz talked a little bit about the tons that are being lost in different portions of the state. So as you think about your own property, and then think about the area where you live. I don't know what that geography looks like, but talk a little bit about what the geography of where you are farming, and how you think that you're moving, or what you'd like to do to kind of move to that zero below the 1 ton tolerable rates. And how do you know that you're doing better? You're doing some of the you're doing the practices that we talked about that should be done. How do you actually know, or what are the signs that you think that both the water that's leaving your fields is a better quality, and that you're actually holding more of the soil than maybe your neighbors are, or maybe the region where you live naturally would? And I'll open that to any one of you to start.
Well, I guess empirical evidence, no, we don't know. But what we can rely on are maybe research that Bill's done at his farm to demonstrate that Iowa State's been involved with, to show that if you implement this practice, you should see this kind of reduction in runoff or sedimentation or improved water quality. And those are the things that we're relying on. And that's why research and development is so important for us to say, yeah, that looks like a good practice because the research says or demonstrates that we should see these kind of results. And that's really all we have to rely on. Now, granted, there's always that gut feel. And I think as a farmer, you'd probably be better have some gut instincts in order to try to make the right decisions as you go through a career or a year. And, we can see it. We see improved water quality in our grass waterways after that 3 or 4 inch rain. They aren't as muddy as they once were. To say that we have zero runoff now, absolutely not. But certainly that would be the goal for us someday. And that's why things like prairie strips, I think, are something that we will be looking at very closely. But then to be able to determine whether the prairie strip is going to be beneficial for us with improved water quality, well, we won't know because we aren't doing that research on farm currently, so we won't know what the improvement will be. But nevertheless, we can see it, and so it'll be a subjective measurement.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one that's really kind of hard to put your hands around without spending a lot of time and effort and some money to get that data. So we do rely on the experts to do that research for us and tell us which practices will improve. I know Iowa Soybean Association has an on-farm network and their environmental programs and services division that does some of that work for us. We rely on them. We actually tell them, hey, take a look at this. They'll go and do it, and they'll tell us what the results are. We know things like bioreactors are going to take nitrates out of the tile water. We know that saturated buffer strips are going to do the same thing. So we don't necessarily have to measure it on our own farm, but like Bryan, I can tell you that when we went from a tillage system to a no-till system, we no longer have sediment in the waterways. We don't have to go in every 5 to 7 years and clean out those waterways and put the soil back where it came from. We don't have to touch them anymore. So that's something that we know that there's been improvement there.
A great rule of thumb.
Yeah. It's you believe what you can see sometimes, and we can see that there's not the sediment moving off of those farm fields. We can see that with the water that's coming down through those waterways at the same time. You walk out there after rain, and it's cloudy but generally clear water as opposed to muddy water that they used to be. So I don't need to measure that. I can tell you that it's better.
Mm-hmm.
5 years ago, how our project got started, Nancy was on EPC, and Bill Stowe, who was a Nevada High School graduate, I'm sure you all heard about the lawsuit that was put against 3 counties in the state of Iowa. And Iowa Cattlemen asked myself to go down and speak when they were deciding whether or not to go through with the allegations. And Nancy got up and spoke as far as EPC. And soybean got up and spoke in favor, and I think corn was there. And that was it. And then there were 40 individuals that, there's every reason in the world why that should have gone through or should not have gone through. And so coming home, I actually had a magazine that my son had been featured in, The New Wave of Farming, and I gave a copy to all the commissioners on the copy. I said, please read this, because this is what the new kids on the block are starting to do, and we have faith that this is working today. So going home, I looked at Nance and I said, Bill could have got up and asked me for my data. I have nothing, just like Bryan said here. We have nothing to show. And so my last ask 2 years ago, after we finished up our bale study, I went to Monsanto Bear and I said, I've got an idea here. I said, let's go down on this 240 because it does represent basically all the soil types in the state of Iowa and has this 15 acres that has never been broken. My great-grandfather used to put wild horse hay up on it. So that's going to be our control. And so it's broke off into 9 different zones. We've gone in and pattern tiled it so that we can collect water samples off each one of those zones. We're going to do different farming practices on each one of those 40 or 60 acre strips. And then we're going to use gated tile because we think that if we can hold that water in some time in the fields a little bit longer, that the plant life can utilize the nutrients that's left in that water and then release that water. There was a picture that was put up here that I just wanted to stand up and shout that I think we've got a way we figured it out. We wanted to show all the ponds in that field. Well, in this field, we've got a place where there's a huge pond in it. So we had a place to put a bioreactor on. So now all of a sudden, instead of not planting that or putting that to grass, because this is a very high productive farm, we can get rid of that water a little bit faster and run it through a bioreactor. And I don't know what the results are going to be yet, but we think it's going to improve. So each quadrant, we're going to do a different, and it's on large scale. It's not on small strips. And so between the saturated buffers, the bioreactors, and the riparian buffers, there's about 15 or 20 different things going on here. And then Iowa State, we've asked Matt Helmer to come out and put 2 wells out in this natural prairie to see what the natural phenomenon is of nitrates. I mean, people know, but actually one of these sites needs to be in about every quadrant of Iowa because we're all different. I mean, his land is much different than mine because of the Webster Clarion soils that we have. So every year now, we're going to host we're going to put a tent up the 1st of August, and it'll come down after Farm Progress Show. And last year we had about 2,000 people go through here just to show them what a bioreactor looked like opened up. I've worked with AgriDrain, and they're going to come in and put monitors so that we're going to be able to analyze water quality or what's in that water real time instead of having to go out and gather a sample. And with the gated tiles and some of the other situations we're going to utilize, why we're going to have real-time information. We're going to let Iowa State put that curve together so that, you know, they always say, well, farmers never going to tell you the truth. Well, they just tell you what you want to hear. So when we look at the next 10-year project and working with IDNR and EPA very closely on this, we feel very fortunate that, as you said, we don't know those numbers. And in Story County, this is what could happen if you change this practice on this farm, whether it's pig manure, cattle manure, whether you take all the crops off, cover crops. What happens to that water quality and soil health when you change the practice on top? And how can we affect that? And we've got a website that's called Modern Ag Farm, and we'd love to have you go to that. We're going to host tours all through August, and if you'd like to come out, why, it'll be posted on there when those tours will be, because we think it's very important that to be able to have real-time data now to show them how farmers are being proactive, not reactive to what's going to happen here, because the last thing a farmer wants is for EPA to come out and tell you what you're going to do. We want a seat at that table to be able to sit down with our data and say, this is what happens when you do this. So then I went to the governor and I went to EPA in DC a few weeks ago, and I said, you know, and Secretary Northey, and I said, we've got a real opportunity here to take this, and if you change something on top, and if you can quantify that about what happens when it comes out your tile. I mean, I've been involved in the ethanol industry since it started, and we've already got tax credits and RINs in place. What would happen, and this can't happen tomorrow, it's going to take a few years, and I see Mike sitting back there. Mike, I'm going to call you to the mat on this one. But what would happen if we can demonstrate how you change something on top, you can change the water quality coming out, and a farmer gets a tax or a RIN credit? Wouldn't that be something? Then it's no longer that voluntary thing. Now the farmer has a way to be able to go and say, I'm going to change my practice here because I know through this monitoring it's going to change this, and I'm going to get a tax credit or a RIN because this land has to have tile in it. I mean, you saw that picture there. I mean, that's just horrible. And when you rent a farm, cash rent a farm, you pay for every acre. I mean, I don't care if you buy it, you know, it's for every acre, and we have to produce on it, and there are ways to produce on it, and there's ways to drain it efficiently, effectively, but I still think there's a way that farmer can get paid to do that. or some kind of program to get him going. I'll quit. I could run on this all day.
Okay, so it's very clear to me, and I suspect it's very clear to our audience. We chose these three farmers really well, didn't we? They're innovators. They're thinking about every acre. They're trying to think about how to do things differently. And if every farmer in Iowa looked like one of you guys, we probably would be all set, right?
Oh, nobody wants to look like me.
Okay, so. But many of your characteristics are very similar. You're generational farms. The land is important to you, and we know that that's a value across Iowa of farmers. We know that your operations. Now we are missing. There's a hole in our conversation, and I as a specialty crop grower, I have to acknowledge that. I know we're in Iowa, but even Iowa has the potential and has specialty crop growers, and we did make an attempt to bring one. Find one or two to join us. We were not successful, but I don't want you to think that cattle and corn and soy are the only thing that's happening, because we do need to be cognizant that Iowa has huge potential in the specialty crop area. But here's my question. Bill sort of talked about it a little bit from generation to generation, but I want to know, you're the leading edge, so how do we normatize the behavior that you have, the management that you have, the way you have of thinking about, okay, this is a problem, what are some of the ways I can do that? And it's a willingness to risk experimentation and fail. It actually is, because all the things that you've talked about, all three of you had to be willing to fail before you actually tried it, right? I mean, you were hoping that it would work. You did the research, you checked things out, but there was always a chance that it would fail. So how do we talk to not just your neighbors? I don't know if all your neighbors are looking at you and say, oh, I'm going to be just exactly like. And so they're trying those same things through. So how do we reproduce, not exactly what's happened on your farm, how do we reproduce this willingness to experiment, to try to be more observant about what's happening, and to realize that the practice that we did in the past, even no-till, may not be sufficient to get us where we need to be. And Bill makes it sound like, so I'm going to put Bill on the spot first. I know he's averse to being the guy that answers the question first, but I'm going to put him on the spot because many of our farms in Iowa do have the next generation coming back to the farm. And I'm a sociologist, and I have to tell you that when I interview other farmers and I talk to them, one of the conversations that they say to me is, the younger farmer says, he won't let me do this the way I need to do this. And
You've been talking to my son, haven't you?
The dad will say, you know what we're doing, it's not broke yet, so we need to keep doing it, what we're doing. How do we have the conversations between generations to adopt those? And you other two may also have family that are coming back, and so how do you have those conversations? And then I want you to tell us whether they're spirited or whether you just have this very calm conversation about, oh yeah, you're probably right, we'll do this. What kind of negotiation happens, and what's it take to be able to have that intergenerational conversation? And maybe that intergenerational conversation is not between you and a family member, but maybe it's between a neighbor that's trying to do something or tried to do something different, either older than you or younger than you. So, Dave, you look like you were ready to say something.
Yeah. I actually have a lot to say about that,
okay.
that particular part, because I'm Bill's son. So figuratively,
Different mother.
I worked,
Twin son.
I was growing up in the 80s during the last farm crisis, and I was attending Iowa State University and questioning, because my dad pushed me out, said, ag is no place for you to go. There's no future in it. So it's probably one of the few bits of advice that I took, and I went and worked for a Fortune 500 company for about 12 or 13 years before I decided it was time to come back. And one of the things that I learned in that time period is that sacred cows make really tasty hamburgers. So one of the things that I worked at the company was in a continual improvement team. So we looked at everything and questioned everything. And it was with that mindset I came back to the farm. And so I looked at everything we were doing and thought to myself, is this the best way that we could do this? Is it the most efficient? Is it the best path going forward? And my dad fought me on every step. Sometimes those conversations were spirited. Sometimes they were low key as I learned to maneuver around and make him think it was his idea and then pat him on the back when he made the change. But at that point, I decided if I ever had kids, I wouldn't do that same thing. So I have tasked my 25-year-old with the same thing. Look at everything. Look at everything we're doing. And if you don't think it's the right thing or the best way to do it, tell me. And we're going to have a conversation about it. You can justify the new practice to us. We're going to make this a business decision. We're going to take the emotion out of it. And we're going to move forward. And he's already really taken that on and look at everything we're doing. And maybe it's just a way, when we haul corn from this farm, instead of taking it here, we should take it there. Or when we're feeding cattle, maybe this is an easier way to do it than that was. So we're taking all those things, but it really had to come from within. It was really me coming back and deciding, he's doing the best he can, but this isn't the best way it could be. And I took that upon myself to say, we're going to make a change here. But the question you asked is really two different things. One is dealing with family, which I answered. The other is dealing with neighbors in the surrounding community. That is sometimes leading by example. We were one of the first in our neighborhood to start no-tilling in a wide area. Neighbors noticed. They started asking questions, and we'd talk about it. This is saving me time, money, and it's improving my bottom line. Iowa Soybean Association just finished a study that some of these conservation practices are adding up to $88 an acre to the bottom line of those folks who have implemented those practices. Variable rate fertilizer, no-till, some of those things. And telling your neighbor, walking up to him and say, Bryan, if you do this, it's adding $90 to my bottom line. You maybe should think about this. Or he comes to me and said, what's it doing? I can show you on paper, this is what it does. So that's a different conversation you have to have with the neighbors. But that data is out there, and if they ask, it's an easy conversation to have.
Okay, thanks.
Bill, go ahead.
So, Bill, how acrimonious is this conversation?
Well, it's all the above. Like I say, I asked my dad will turn 90 here in 2 weeks, and I tell him every day, and before I end the phone call, I say, will you please forgive me? Because I understand what he went through when I was 25, coming back to the farm, and the discussions that Tim and I have meeting every morning, and we sit down and figure out what we're going to do, because my job right now is peeling him off the wall so he can get his crop in, because he's home now running the crews with the combines, and he goes, Dad, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm on a panel. Why? I said, because Ray asked me. And he goes, well, that's okay if Ray asked me. But anyway, back to, we've been very fortunate, like I say. We have the two new Dr. Dans at Iowa State University, and the gentleman, Elmer Paul, who started this feedlot back in the 30s, was an Iowa State grad, and he opened his doors as a teaching farm. And so when I took it over, we were very good friends, and I said, this has worked for him pretty well. Let's just kind of keep doing it. So in the past, 40, 50 years, I've had about 160 kids go through there. But in turn with that, I've also had the opportunity to let Iowa State come in and do many different projects that I would have never thought of or been able to do, and be on that cutting edge. And learning to fail gracefully, I think, is what I tell these kids in the entrepreneurial class at Iowa State University. You have to learn to fail gracefully, and I think you brought that up. But what did you learn from that? And one of the things that we decided with this water quality project, we weren't going to involve the farmers at all. I mean, they all saw the big tent out in the pasture and the cows and calves walking up to the people so they could lick them. But we invited urban people, and we invited people from across the United States and the country. In fact, we had the National Reporters Tour held there in August, where they actually have to apply to be able to come on this tour, and they picked Iowa. So we had CNN, we had the San Francisco Herald, we had all the big newspapers, and I think you were out there at that one. And anyway, it was fascinating that we feel that we have to get to the public first. Because if the public right now, we're the villain. I mean, we're the ones that are adulterating the earth, and we're doing everything wrong, and we're not doing anything to fix it. And we have very large farmers, and the farmers are getting bigger. Well, there's a reason they're getting bigger, is because a lot of kids want to have that 8-hour day, and they want their weekends free, and that's fine. That's their choice. Because Nancy and I didn't build this farm for our sons. That's ours, and we told them both. If you come back, that's fine. If you don't, you're not going to hurt our feelings. So I think the goal here is, and I spend a lot of time at EPA and DNR, is that we have to make sure as farmers we have a seat at that table, and we have to tell them what we're doing, and I think we have to circle around to the urban people first, because the farmers are going to be a whole different can of worms, because we've got some very large farming operations that don't you dare get in front of the corn planter, the combine, or the tillage tool, or we'll run over you. And there's going to be, if we're going to make this change, we have to be able to show them, whether it's the tile, if we can get some kind of a tax credit or a RIN from that extra effort, or how, the hardest thing that we have to do today is to try to tell people how that cover crop pays for itself. It's a real expense. I mean, and then you got to kill it in the spring. So through this water quality, soil health, and I'll keep talking about that, we need to make sure we get the urban people educated first, because their lawn is the most important thing to do, and they're probably the biggest violator out there. So let's circle around here, and then we'll take it to our farmers, because through media and social media, they're going to hear about this through what the people are going to be here. Because only 1.5% of us are farmers. That means all the rest of the people are urban. So why would we focus on the farmer?
Brian, you want to take this on?
I'll try to keep it short. My kids are a whole heck of a lot smarter than I am. We've got a son who's an ag and biosystems engineering graduate and went on to get his law degree, and he does IP law work for Deere and Company. Although he was corporate counsel for Kinsey when we decided to build our digester, and I says, well, we're going to be our own EPC general contractor. I says, I need a project manager. I got to start interviewing. He says, well, Dad, I might be interested in doing that. I says, well, we can't afford you. But he did. He quit. He come over and he worked for us for a little over a year, built the project, probably the best experience from a business family relationship standpoint, you could ever ask for, to have your son be the project manager of a $7.5 million investment. He did an awesome job. Of course, after it was up and running, he says, well, Dad, I'm going to go make some real money now, and you can run this. So that's where we're at. He works for Deere and Company. And then our daughter is a healthcare administration, or she was a dietetics graduate from the College of Agriculture at Iowa State, went on to get her master's of healthcare administration. She works for the university hospitals as a HR director. Our daughter-in-law's got her MBA. Our son-in-law is getting his MBA this next year, but he does work for us. He helps my wife in the office. So I'm really not sure who's going to take over our farming operation. We do have some very, very dedicated employees. I have one employee who's been with us 25 years, and he's the kid that I hired when I first started farming to help ride the bean buggy and zap, button weeds with Roundup when we were driving through. And now he's farming almost 1,000 acres himself. He's got a cow-calf operation. He's our largest customer in our feedlot, and he's also my feedlot manager as well as our crop operations manager. And so that's kind of how I've helped bring someone in whose parents used to plow and disc 2 or 3 times, run a field cultivator and a harrow, and the kind of agronomic line of practices that we all probably went through as kids. And now he's a full believer in strip till, no till, cover crops, utilizing livestock in our operations to improve and enhance soil health. And so maybe that's how we do it, is just by example and getting others involved in that process. I always said we don't really ever tell our kids what they can and can't do. We just set expectations, and that we try to do the same thing with our own farming operation and hope people can learn from that in our neighborhood.
Okay, thank you. We began this program this afternoon with Paul Tremlindo, the governor's representative. Is Paul still here, or did he leave? Well, if you remember his speech, one of the things that he spoke about was that Iowa agriculture is our livelihoods. It's really important to us in Iowa, and it's important to us in this room, along with the gentlemen that are here. And so I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to answer a question about the future, but I'd like for our IT people to put up the two questions that we're first going to ask our farmers here, and then I want you to be thinking about how you would answer it too, because we're going to have an open mic here to begin to have that conversation. I think the conversation that we've had so far should be raising lots of kinds of thoughts in your minds about where we're at now and where we're at for the future. Oh, I'm the one that's supposed to monitor that. Forgive me. Okay, thank you. And so the question that I want you three to sort of kick us off with this afternoon is, as you think about the future of Iowa agriculture, what trends have really disappointed you? Now, this is beyond yourself. Thinking about you're now part of a cohort of agriculture. What trends have been really disappointing to you that you kind of wish were different? And then what approaches or strategies would you propose, and it could just be one or two, that you think if we took that step here in Iowa as an agricultural community, or Bill has challenged us to think of as people of Iowa, not necessarily just in agriculture, but because we're knowledgeable of agriculture and maybe from an urban background, how would you begin to address that disappointing trend that you're calling attention to? Now, we have probably a number of them, so I just would like each one of you to name one trend that you sort of think is disappointing and begin the conversation about what we might do to begin to reverse that trend or change it. And while they're having that conversation, I'd like those of you in the audience to look at these two questions because I want you to begin to talk about that too, because the three people up here are not enough to change. We need the people out here. We need each one of us to do something different, and then we've got to find our network of people that would also do something different. So who wants to start that?
I'd give it a shot.
Okay, thank you. So
I think the most disappointing aspect that really involves agriculture in general is when you look at profitability. We've been challenged with increasing production, yields per acre for generations, and so here we are producing 200 to 250 bushel corn and 70 bushel beans. And we're still at a level that's just barely profitable, and that might even be a bit of a stretch this year. So we've been at this a long time, and let's just face it, we're at break even. That's disappointing. What do we need to do to generate a rate of return that allows us sitting up here, anyone in the audience who's involved in production agriculture, and our neighbors to achieve a higher level or a better level of profitability? And that's where I think we can talk about that either now or later, but I think that there's some real opportunities for us to do that. And I think a low carbon future is what we need to focus on to enhance that profitability, because again, it gets back to that soil, how we value that soil, what we do to that soil to enhance its quality and its health. And if we value that, whether it's on a per pound or per unit basis, we don't really care whether it's a RIN or a carbon credit or you name it, but we really need to focus on how do we provide some value and monetize the carbon that we're actually sequestering and keeping in our soil for the farmer, so that he can actually generate some profit in years of low prices. The other thing, I guess, maybe is in terms of a trend is how social media can really take an issue and run with it. All of us up here are livestock producers. I believe with every ounce of energy in my body that livestock production is a solution to climate change and environmental stewardship. And I think we've all tried to demonstrate how when you take manure and either process it through our digesters or utilize it in your cropping operation, you enhance soil health. You couldn't have organic agriculture without livestock manure. So, why not place a higher value on those things that we're doing? Now, we realize that we have an impact on water quality, on air quality, but let's look at those practices that enhance and improve air quality and water quality. And by the way, it also improves our soil health. So that's another disappointing aspect. I'd like to see our organizations here in Iowa, whether the producer organizations especially, and I think ISA needs to be given a lot of credit for the leadership they provided by doing whatever they can in terms of enhancing and valuing and monetizing water quality efforts through production agriculture. That's where we really need to say to our producer organizations, we need to step up and realize that we can do better, whether it's a better effort at social media, whether it's a better effort at production practices that value carbon in our soils, but it's time to do like social media has done to us, and that's kind of fast forward our lives. We don't have time to sit and wait for another 10 years of research. I think we need to start acting a little more quickly, and I realize that's completely opposite of what we have grown accustomed to over the years with our democratic style of government, as well as some of our producer organizations who tend to be, very cautious in their approach about making changes. I think it's time for all of us in this room to go to those producer organizations and say, no, now's the time to make some changes because the light is at the end of the tunnel. We don't want it to be a train that's going to run us over. Thanks.
Brian, you need to run again. Your campaign manager. I'd like to go next because I'm really going to be short on this one. Mine is time. This isn't a quick fix. I mean, what we've talked about up here is going to take decades. We look at the projects that, Bryan with these digesters, I mean, it's $7 million and you can't, and I don't produce enough, I have a lot of cattle, but I don't produce enough manure to put one in. And I look at the data that's going to come out of that. I look at the data that could come out of our farm project and the other projects like it. It's time. It's going to take decades. We're going to talk about this forever. And I guess I got to be real careful, but I'm disappointed in my neighbors. It's really disappointing to see the pushback you get from neighbors that you're trying something new and you hear about it through the grapevine, what they've talked about, but they don't have guts enough to come up and ask you what you're doing and what results you're getting. And I think that's one reason we've kind of backed away from the farm community right now, to make sure that we have some real data and then go in front of our peers and say, guys, gals, we've got this, we can prove this. This is one solution to maybe be able to recoup some of that energy or some of those funds you've put in it. But I'm old enough, I'm the oldest one on the panel. I'm not gonna see that day of glory. And I hope I do, but I just think it's gonna take so much time. And back to your point, we need to get going. We're out of time. And we have to be at that table. Because remember what I said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Okay, Dave, you got some thoughts?
Yeah, and a couple of the trends that we've kind of poked around a little bit and really have never got off the ground in a real way is sort of this notion of value added, adding value to our produce, whether it be on the meat side or the grain side. Part of that's the identity preserved portion of the grain side of things. And I think there's some opportunity to partner with end users and look at a specific quality that they want in grain, whether it be corn or soybeans, and try to find a way to aggregate that and maybe design a specific amino acid profile in a soybean, for example, or the same thing in a corn seed that's used for feed, because we have to, even as the grain on the grain side, our largest customer is the livestock industry here in Iowa. So we have to make sure that what we're producing is given the best value to those livestock producers, myself included. So, we've kind of poked around the issue, but we've never really found a real solution to it, and I think it's something that we still need to continue to focus on. Another one of the things is, we have segmentation in agriculture, whether it be conventional tillage versus no-till, and I mean you can come up with 20 or 30 different segments of agriculture, and we all should be learning from each other, because what I do on my farm might be valuable to somebody else, but I always keep my eyes open too, and learning from folks like Bill and Bryan. There's things that they're doing in their operation that I take home and I'll think about over the next few days, and is there something there that we need to do? And back to that sacred cow idea, is there something that I'm doing that I'm holding sacred that really it shouldn't be? Well, let's put her on the grill and get moving forward. So I think those are kind of the couple of first top line issues.
Okay, I think that gets us started. So do we have a microphone someplace? All right, we've got a microphone. Who'd like to sort of take on one or two of those questions? Please, go ahead.
I'd like to add on a little bit. I farm in northern Iowa where none of this stuff's supposed to work, but I'm going to agree a lot with Bryan. I think in my honest analysis, addressing soil carbon will probably take us the furthest down the line, because if our soil carbon is going down, we're doing something wrong. If our soil carbon is going up, we're doing things right. And I think you can engage landowners in that discussion, because you're honestly changing their asset value depending on what that soil carbon is doing. And so we need to put systems together that work wherever you live that address soil carbon, whether it be, in our case, no-till, strip-till, and cover crops. It's taken us 25 years to gain 2.5 points, but that's over half of my farming lifetime, so it doesn't happen fast. But I think rewarding, farmers for building soil carbon will probably be one of the keys to engage the many farmers out there that don't believe that their practices are harmful to soil carbon. You talk to most farmers and tell them that tillage is destructive to their soil carbon and their soil structure, and they kind of shrug their shoulders and, well, it works. Well, they're still harvesting. Many of them up in especially the north central Iowa have pretty rich soils. They still have a lot of soil carbon they can harvest and produce fantastic yields, but we all realize that in a century there'll be a lot less of it. And until we help engage with them that discussion about what's happening to soil carbon, how we can build it and rebuild it in regenerative form, then we can move forward. So, that to me, we can look at practices, but until we all put it together in a system and really focus it on soil carbon, because we address soil carbon, we're going to address water quality, we're going to address soil health, we're going to address erosion, because basically you can't grow soil carbon until you actually change a lot of practices that have been, negligent to soil health.
Thank you.
Dr. Morton, could I?
Surely, yes.
Could I just respond? It's going to take money. There's no question about it. And that's where coming up that ultimate solution on valuing carbon is what it's really going to be all about. I had the privilege of being able to present to the Senate Ag Committee on November 7th, and certainly wanted to thank Representatives Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst here today. Wouldn't have been able to do that, and it was in regard to the implementation of the 2018 Farm Bill. And there was tremendous work done on behalf of the Senate as well as the House to implement a number of programs The problem is none of the programs have been funded, and that's a big part of the problem right now, is that we can't seem to get the funding for things like BCAP, which we participated in, Biomass Crop Assistance Program. We were essentially getting money for the corn stover we were taking off our fields to use as bedding in our cattle barns that would essentially go back through our digesters so that we could return it back to the field. It was a terrific program. That's not funded. There's a number of programs that haven't been funded, and they know that. The U.S. Senate knows exactly what the problem is, and all of those bills have to start in the House. So, that would be my first suggestion, is we really look at funding a number of programs that are part of the 2018 Farm Bill but haven't been funded yet.
Thank you. Yes.
Adam Keel from the Iowa Soybean Association. I appreciate the conversation about kind of market-based solutions, and I think I heard hints of that come out a lot. And I really appreciate, Bryan, your comment about giving farmers flexibility to come up with their own solutions that have value to someone else. We're going to be launching what's called the Iowa Soil and Water Infrastructure Fund, which aligns water interests with interests of carbon sequestration to bundle a multi-payer payment to farmers for practices that they do on their farm. And I just wonder, I heard a lot of what I felt like were good responses to kind of ecosystem market payments, but I wonder if you have any concerns about those and what those might be.
That's a very, very good question. Initially, on the outset, it's always the devil is in the details, right? In the implementation of programs, and whether there will be sufficient funding in that effort to help make a difference, because it all comes down. I'm sure Ray would second me on this. It has to be economically viable, whatever those alternative practices that we are going to implement. They have to have a positive return. And they're probably not going to be a 12 to 15% return like a Fortune 500 company is going to be required. But boy, if we can make 2 or 3% on our money, we'd be just tickled to death on a cover crop or a prairie strip or some new practice that we'd like to be able to monetize. And we're actually, I wanted to just mention too, one thing we did here 3 years ago is we did manage to get 3 crops in 2 years. And if we could essentially monetize that practice and that level of intense agriculture that utilized our digester, utilized our manure, utilized the materials that come out of our digester, I think that would be a great start. If we could add a 3rd crop in a 2-year cycle, I think that's going to be a big head start. And I know we can talk more about that later, but it really worked out for us and was a very, very successful effort.
And to kind of add to Bryan's point here, we have an opportunity today that we didn't have 20 years ago. Today we as associations, whether it's pigs, pork, or feather, we can go in and sit down with the IDNR, and we didn't used to be able to do that and have conversations. I look at our IDOLs, and I see Secretary Neg sitting out there. I mean, we have the stars have aligned. We can go to EPA in D.C. and we can have those conversations from across the table. We no longer yell and scream at each other. We talk about solutions and how it's going to affect each side and how we go through. So back to your whole point there, we have an opportunity here to be able to take these new ideas to this leadership, no matter what agency it is, and sit at the table and be able to visit about it and come up with a solution. And we didn't have that 20 years ago. So who's going to run with the ball?
Okay. Other comments?
Lois, I appreciate where this panel has gone. I am a little bit concerned that our conversation is under, okay, we've got a few problems now. Here are some things we can do to fix some of the problems we have now. We're not looking far enough into the future to say there are even some more serious issues, especially in the way of climate, that we need to face. But we've got to think about those, about how we're going to fix those, let alone trying to fix the issues we're dealing with right now.
How much time do we have?
That's a good point. Can I speak to that for a second? That's a good point. But we kind of know what we know, and we don't know what the climate's going to look like 30 or 50 years down the road. We have a pretty good guess. The science is telling us where it is. But we as producers kind of have to deal with what's right in front of us and then plan for that future. So it's a little bit hard for me to plan for something 20 or 30 years down the road. I probably won't quite still be farming then. I hope to be retired by then. But we let the science kind of lead us, but we have to deal with what's right in front of us today. What a farming system looks like 50 years in the future that will deal with the shifting corn belt, just as the climate warms and we become more CO2 intensive. What are we going to have to do? I don't have the answer to that. So we look for the experts at Iowa State and other land-grant universities around the country to study those things. I know Cornell has done some work with what happens when the CO2 rises in the environment. How do the plants react to that? And then we take that and try to adapt it back into our operation. It's kind of hard to do until it happens. So I can't adapt for something that's not quite here yet either. I can plan for it. I can have an open mind to what shift that's going to be, but until it happens, it's kind of hard to get there for us.
Okay, thank you.
I have
Those
to
are
add-
actually...
Can I add one point to that,
Surely,
though, and then
yes.
I'll quit?
Okay.
The thing that's frustrating to me the most is it seems like the United States is going to fix climate change, and it's a world problem. And how do we bring the whole world into this? That's I think the question we've got to answer.
Oh, that's a good thing to end on or to start a beginning, right? I would like for all of you to join me thanking our panelists. And then, Ernie, are you going to segue us into the next sequence of where we're at?